The initial scream ripped through the serene, elegant atmosphere of the restaurant long before anyone even bothered to look up from their plates. Suddenly, a wave of panic erupted as heavy glass shattered across the gleaming, polished floors. Masked intruders swarmed through the front entrance, their aggressive shouts sending terrified families scrambling in every direction, diving desperately beneath tables. Amidst the sudden chaos and confusion, a quiet single father who had arrived 10 minutes late for what was shaping up to be an awkwardly formal blind date didn't panic. Instead, he calmly swept a trembling little girl behind a sturdy marble pillar, threw his own body over an elderly couple to shield them from flying debris, and seemed to instinctively anticipate every single move of the attackers before anyone else even grasped the gravity of what was unfolding. Across the room, powerful corporate CEO Meredith stood frozen in absolute disbelief. She had anticipated a predictable, unremarkable afternoon sharing a meal with an overworked, tired widower. Instead, she found herself spellbound, watching a man navigate a terrifying crisis with impossible precision while putting his life on the line for complete strangers. Only 2 hours prior, Meredith had reluctantly agreed to this blind date after enduring months of persistent nagging from her older sister. At 39, she had successfully built one of the country's fastest-growing architectural firms, graced the covers of prestigious business magazines, and delivered keynote speeches at international conferences. Her life was an endless loop of high-stakes meetings, intense negotiations, and exhausting flights across time zones. Yet, every glittering award she accepted felt hollow and cold whenever she returned to her dead silent penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline. She had long since convinced herself that love was simply another necessary sacrifice that driven, successful people had to make. When her sister first described the man she wanted Meredith to meet, an immediate wave of disappointment had washed over her. His name was Graham Ellison, a widowed father raising an 8-year-old daughter all on his own while grinding away as a risk management consultant. Meredith had painted a mental picture of someone entirely ordinary, utterly predictable, and living miles away from her fast-paced, high-society world. In fact, she had nearly canceled the date twice before deciding to just push through one lunch to finally get her family off her back. True to form, Graham arrived radiating a quiet, grounded confidence rather than wearing expensive designer fashion. His neatly pressed blue shirt bore no fancy luxury labels, and the only unusual accessory he wore was a simple, scratched silver watch that clearly had years of history behind it. His daughter, Nora, beamed with a warm, bright smile while quietly coloring with the crayons provided by the restaurant staff. Meredith couldn't help but notice the sincere way Graham apologized for bringing his daughter along after a last-minute babysitter cancellation. Rather than acting fussy or entitled, Nora displayed impeccable manners, thanking every single server with genuine, heartfelt appreciation. Meredith had silently written Graham off as kind, sure, but entirely ordinary. While she deeply respected fathers who poured themselves into raising their kids, she remained convinced that their separate worlds could never possibly mesh. But as they started chatting, Graham caught her completely off guard by asking deeply thoughtful questions instead of trying to stroke her ego or impress her with jargon. He seemed genuinely fascinated by the human beings behind her company rather than the flashy headlines praising her net worth. When Meredith confessed that she often felt crushed under the immense weight of hundreds of employees depending entirely on her choices, Graham offered a profound observation. He quietly noted that true leadership turns dangerous the moment people forget they are entrusted with protecting actual lives rather than guarding their corporate reputations. Those words stuck with her, lingering in her mind far longer than she expected. Then the world turned upside down. The attackers surged into the room with terrifying speed, their leader bellowing orders while accomplices blocked every exit route. Panic swept through the dining room like wildfire as customers fled blindly. For one agonizing, frozen second, Meredith stood paralyzed, completely unable to process how a peaceful afternoon lunch had morphed into a waking nightmare. Graham, however, did not freeze. Moving with practiced stealth that drew zero attention to himself, he guided Nora underneath heavy stone seating built right into the wall, tossed his jacket over her to keep her hidden, and scanned the room with laser-sharp focus. His expression remained utterly unshakable. Every single movement he made was calculated and fluid. When one of the masked intruders lunged at a terrified waitress, Graham spotted a stray serving tray lying flat near his shoes. With breathtaking timing, he slid the metal tray across the slick floor. It slammed straight into the attacker's ankle, breaking his balance just long enough for the waitress to bolt to safety behind a reinforced counter. Before anyone could even process what had just happened, Graham had already smoothly repositioned himself as a human shield between the gunman and a cluster of crying children. Meredith watched, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't dumb luck. This was the unmistakable mark of professional-grade experience. As another attacker tried herding frightened patrons toward the center of the room, Graham subtly motioned for several families to slip away down a service hallway using hand signals so discreet the gunman never noticed. When an elderly man lost his footing and tumbled forward in a panic, Graham darted out, catching him just inches from the floor and hoisting him up, risking his own cover to save a stranger. Every instinct he possessed put the safety of others miles ahead of his own survival. A sudden, jarring realization hit Meredith. She knew absolutely nothing about the man sitting across from her just minutes ago. The horrifying standoff stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, barely 20 minutes had passed. Emergency sirens wailed outside as law enforcement finally converged on the building, alerted by hidden staff who had managed to trip the silent alarms in the kitchen. While negotiators worked frantically outside, one of the cornered attackers spotted Graham tending to a customer whose arm was badly gashed by broken glass. The gunman charged directly toward them with murderous intent. Without a moment's hesitation, Graham stepped out into the open, deliberately drawing the attacker's fire and attention away from the wounded civilian. What happened next left everyone utterly stunned. Graham disarmed the gunman with blinding speed, utilizing precise, defensive martial arts techniques designed to neutralize the threat while minimizing permanent injury to the attacker and keeping innocent bystanders completely safe. Realizing the police had tightly locked down every possible escape route, the remaining attackers threw down their weapons and surrendered. The nightmare was finally over. As paramedics rushed in to treat the shaken patrons, Meredith found herself staring at Graham, utterly unable to wrap her head around what she had just witnessed. Reporters quickly swarmed the perimeter outside, interviewing customers who breathlessly recounted the heroic deeds of the mysterious father whose quiet bravery had averted a bloodbath. Yet, Graham actively avoided every camera lens, choosing instead to focus entirely on comforting Nora, who clung tightly to his arm without shedding a single tear. It wasn't until the police wrapped up their formal debriefings that Meredith finally learned the truth. Years ago, Graham had served as a high-ranking operative within an elite international protective security detail, specializing in guarding diplomats, humanitarian workers, and vulnerable civilians trapped in some of the most dangerous conflict zones on Earth. He had quietly walked away from that harrowing life after losing his beloved wife, Clara, to a sudden, devastating illness. Having sworn an oath to give Nora the peaceful, stable childhood she deserved, he walked away from lucrative security contracts to embrace a quiet consulting job, and he had never once felt the need to brag about his past. He didn't hide it out of shame. He simply no longer wanted a life of violence to define who he was. A deep wave of embarrassment washed over Meredith as she looked back on every arrogant assumption she had made. She had judged him simply because he introduced himself as a single father. She had foolishly mistaken his deep humility for ordinary mediocrity. Over the weeks that followed, Meredith found her thoughts drifting less toward Graham's jaw-dropping combat skills and much more toward the boundless, extraordinary compassion that fueled them. During the height of the attack, he had countless opportunities to look out only for Nora's safety. Instead, he repeatedly risked his own life for total strangers who would likely never even learn his name. Seeking to bridge the gap, she invited Graham and Nora to tour her company's latest community housing initiative. Unlike their first awkward lunch, Meredith walked into this meeting stripped of all pretense, armed only with raw honesty. Watching Graham interact effortlessly with construction workers opened her eyes to yet another layer of his character. He listened intently before ever offering an opinion. He treated every single person on site with the exact same measure of deep respect. Nora happily buzzed around handing out boxed lunches to the volunteers, proudly mirroring her father's quiet, unassuming kindness. Quietly and steadily, Meredith had to admit a humbling truth to herself. The rare qualities she had spent years hunting for in cutthroat corporate executives had been standing right in front of her the entire time. Months rolled by, and their bond deepened not through grand, cinematic gestures, but through the sweet, mundane moments of everyday life. They wandered through sunlit parks, cheered at school functions, volunteered together at local shelters, and spent lazy afternoons fixing up community playgrounds financed by Meredith's charitable foundation. Nora slowly grew to trust Meredith completely, eventually inviting her into bedtime reading traditions and messy weekend baking experiments. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Meredith experienced a pure, uncomplicated happiness that had zero to do with profit margins, quarterly targets, or business accolades. Then, an unexpected storm hit. A viral news feature detailing the restaurant hostage situation unexpectedly thrust Graham into the national spotlight. Major television networks lauded his extraordinary heroism. Former military and security colleagues publicly stepped forward to honor his distinguished service. Massive global corporations flooded him with astronomical financial offers, practically begging him to step back into high-risk security leadership roles. The salaries promised a level of wealth most people only dream of. A cold fear gripped Meredith's heart in secret. She worried that once these dazzling opportunities came knocking again, a quiet, domestic family life wouldn't be enough to keep him anchored. Yet, true to her growing respect for him, she refused to pressure him, resolving in her heart to support whatever choice brought him inner peace. A few days later, Graham flatly turned down every single lucrative offer. His reasoning was remarkably simple. Years ago, he had traded away his life protecting VIPs while missing out on birthdays, anniversaries, and the fleeting, precious moments with the people who mattered most. Losing Clara had fundamentally rewired his perspective. He finally understood that all the success in the world means nothing if the people waiting for you at home feel completely alone. No paycheck could ever buy back the time he needed to watch Nora grow up, and no corporate title could ever rival building a genuine future surrounded by people who truly loved one another. Meredith wept softly as she read his public statement, realizing how thoroughly it challenged everything she had ever believed about ambition and success. Inspired by his clarity, Meredith began a massive overhaul of her own corporate culture. She expanded family leave policies, introduced flexible working hours, poured greater resources into comprehensive employee wellness programs, and redirected fat executive bonuses straight into an educational scholarship fund for the children of her workers. While skittish investors initially questioned her unconventional moves, productivity skyrocketed while employee loyalty hit record-breaking highs. Her business emerged stronger and more resilient than ever because people finally felt genuinely valued, not just treated as tools for generating profit. On a bright, sunny afternoon nearly a year after their unforgettable blind date, Meredith hosted a joyful community celebration to mark the official completion of hundreds of affordable homes her firm had constructed. Families laughed freely while children flooded the brand-new playgrounds with bursts of infectious, joyful noise. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Graham and Nora, Meredith looked around and realized this quiet, ordinary afternoon felt infinitely more meaningful than every glamorous corporate gala she had ever attended. The terrifying attack that once looked like the absolute worst day of her life had miraculously turned into the catalyst for her greatest personal transformation. She had walked into that restaurant years ago firmly convinced that impressive titles defined a person's ultimate worth. She walked away understanding that true greatness is rooted entirely in character. As the sun began to dip and the celebration wound down, Graham watched Nora dash across the lawn toward Meredith. Her face lit up with the carefree, unburdened laughter every parent prays to hear. Meredith knew deep down that she was no longer chasing relentless success just to fill the echoes of empty rooms or chase fleeting public applause. She had stumbled upon something infinitely more precious. A family forged not through perfection, sprawling wealth, or social status, but through raw courage, boundless compassion, forgiveness, and the willingness to offer someone a real second chance. The woman who once thought she was sitting down with an ordinary, unassuming single father now understood she had actually crossed paths with an extraordinary man. She realized his greatest strength was never his lethal ability to neutralize a threat. It was his quiet, daily choice to pick love over pride, humility over recognition, and hope over fear. Together, they proved a timeless truth. The most remarkable heroes often walk among us looking entirely ordinary, and the greatest victories in life are won not in blinding moments of high-stakes danger, but in the quiet, everyday decision to care for others long after the crowds have gone home and the applause has faded into silence.